You are kneeling over someone you loved. Their body is still warm. Their eyes are closed. The world around you has not stopped, but yours just did. You could bury them right now. Dig a hole, lower them in, cover the ground, and walk away. It would be enough. It would be over. Instead, your hand moves toward something else. A lump of red earth, ground down between your fingers. And a handful of small shells, each one pierced through the center, saved for exactly this moment. This happened. Not once, not as some strange exception. It happened thousands of times, across tens of thousands of years, in a world with no writing, no metal, no permanent homes. And the reason behind it might be far stranger, and far more human, than you expect. Today, death comes with a script. Flowers arranged just so. A dark suit pressed for the occasion. A headstone cut from stone, with a name and 2 dates carved into it forever. We treat all of this as basic decency, the bare minimum owed to someone who has died. But here's the uncomfortable question. Where did that instinct even come from? Because decorating a body, instead of simply disposing of it, is not something we invented. Not remotely. That instinct reaches back over 100,000 years before the pyramids were built. Before a single seed was ever deliberately planted. Before most of what we call civilization existed in any form. Somewhere in that deep stretch of time, a human being knelt beside a corpse and decided plain burial was not enough. This body needed color. It needed beads. It needed to mean something, even after the person inside it was gone. Which, when you think about it, is a strange thing to prioritize, when your other daily concerns include not getting eaten by a cave hyena. So, let's go back to the very beginning of the story. To the substance that shows up first over and over wherever ancient humans buried their dead. Red ochre. Ochre isn't paint the way we think of paint today. It's a natural earth pigment, colored by iron oxide, the same mineral that turns metal to rust. Sometimes it's a soft, crumbly rock. Sometimes it's ground down into a fine red powder, almost like dried blood. Now picture a timeline stretched out in front of you, 500,000 years long. For most of that timeline, ochre barely registers. One site here, one scrap there. A flicker, easy to miss. Then, around 160,000 years ago, the flickers turn into something else entirely. Dig at site after site, across huge stretches of Africa, and suddenly ochre is just there. Sitting in the dirt, layer after layer, generation after generation. Imagine walking into an ancient camp from that period. Odds are, someone nearby is holding a piece of red stone or has red powder staining their fingertips. That's the difference between an accident and a tradition. A single stain in the dirt could be nothing. A stain that keeps appearing at site after site for thousands of years is a choice being made on purpose over and over. Researchers who study this shift call it exactly that. A turn from occasional to habitual. And they see it as one of our clearest windows into ritual behavior taking root in the human mind. Because ochre wasn't reserved only for the dead. It was also smeared across cave walls in some of the oldest paintings human hands ever made. The same red hand that marked a body was marking meaning onto the walls of the world itself. So by the time humans started deliberately covering their dead in red, they weren't inventing a new idea. They were already living inside a culture soaked in color and symbolism. But ochre is only half of the story. The other half is smaller, quieter, and in some ways, even more personal. Beads. In a cave in eastern Morocco, called the Grotte de Pigeons, near a place called Taforalt, archaeologists found something easy to miss at first glance. A handful of small shells, barely the size of a fingernail. The kind of thing you'd walk past on any beach without a second look. But look closer, and these weren't just shells that happened to end up in a cave. Every single one had a hole, carefully pierced straight through the center. And most of them were still coated in that same red ochre. Using 2 separate dating techniques, researchers placed these shell beads at roughly 82,000 years old. Sit with that for a second. 82,000 years ago, someone sat down with a tiny shell, a sharpened tool, and enough patience to drill a hole through it without shattering it in their hand. Then they strung it, or sewed it onto a piece of clothing, and coated it in the exact same red pigment that was, by then, already showing up on bodies and cave walls elsewhere. Where patterns on the shells even show signs of handling and suspension, meaning these weren't made and immediately discarded. They were worn, carried, kept. This wasn't a stray decoration made on a whim. It was a deliberate design, repeated often enough, carefully enough, to count as tradition. Now, let's jump forward. tens of thousands of years forward, to a burial site called Sunghir, out on the Russian plains, not far from modern-day Moscow. Around 34,000 years ago, a community here buried their dead in a way that still stops archaeologists in their tracks. One grave held an adult man. His body had been covered in ochre, and roughly 3,000 mammoth ivory beads had been sewn directly onto his clothing. Picture that. 3,000 individual beads, each one carved by hand, each one strung or stitched into place, one at a time. Nearby, a second grave held two children, buried head to head, facing each other in the dark. Their burial was even more extreme. Together, they were adorned with more than 10,000 ivory beads, dozens of armbands, and hundreds of pierced fox teeth. Here's the detail that should genuinely stop you. Researchers who tried recreating these beads by hand found that each single one took over an hour to make. That means the man's beadwork alone represents more than 3,000 hours of human labor. The children's burial represents even more than that. Thousands of hours spent by living, grieving people on objects that would go straight into the ground and never be seen by anyone again. That is not a quick gesture. That is not something done out of obligation in an afternoon to check a box. That is a community deciding that a body, even a dead one, was worth an almost unimaginable amount of their time. This is exactly the kind of evidence we build every video around here on Ancestral Explainer. Real sources, real dates, no guessing dressed up as fact. If that's the kind of ancient human history you want more of, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Okay, take a breath with me for a second. Because everything we've covered so far is the evidence. The dates, the beads, the ochre. The part archaeologists can dig up and measure. What comes next is harder. What comes next is the part nobody can dig up. Why? Why go to all this trouble for someone who can no longer see it, wear it, or thank you for it? Archaeologists have spent decades on this question. And honestly, they still don't fully agree. Picture the man buried at Sunghir, wrapped in 3,000 beads. Some researchers look at that and see a resume worn on the body. Status. Every bead announcing exactly who this person was in life. Their rank, their identity, carried into the ground so it wouldn't be forgotten. Now picture something different. Not a resume, but a gift being handed over. Offering. Maybe none of this was about the dead person's identity at all. Maybe it was payment given to them or to spiritual forces the living believed were waiting to receive them. Or picture the mourners themselves, standing at the edge of that grave, afraid. Protection. Maybe the ritual wasn't for the dead at all. Maybe it was meant to shield the living from whatever they believed a death might unleash into the world. Or strip all of that away and picture something simpler. Just a parent, hands shaking, threading bead after bead after bead. Grief. No spirits, no status, just an unbearable need to do something, anything, with your hands, in the face of a loss with no other outlet. Here's the honest truth. No single one of these theories is proven. Not one. This is genuinely, actively still debated among researchers, and it will probably stay that way for a long time. But maybe that uncertainty is not a gap in the story. Maybe it's the point. Because whatever the exact reason was, the behavior itself tells us something we can be certain of. These humans were not just surviving. Not just eating, sleeping, and avoiding predators in the dark. They were thinking symbolically. Assigning meaning to a body that no longer needed food, or warmth, or protection from anything. Death, for them, had stopped being just a biological event. It had become something to interpret. Something to respond to. Something to mark. And that impulse never actually left us. It just changed its materials. We traded red ochre for black cloth. We traded ivory beads for flowers laid gently across a casket. We traded shell necklaces sewn onto burial clothing for granite headstones carved with a name and 2 dates. The technology changed completely. The impulse underneath it did not change at all. Somewhere over 100,000 years ago, a person knelt beside a body and reached for red pigment instead of simply walking away. And in some form, every single one of us has been reaching for that same gesture ever since. So here's what I'm curious about. Of those 4 ideas, status, offering, protection, or grief, which one feels the most convincing to you? And how do you think a community back then decided who got this kind of send-off and who didn't? Let me know in the comments.